So Keenan Jackson, an urban economist, an economic consultant from ID. He's going to give us a bit of insight to what's happening in the world and try and bring that down also into a bit of a Victorian local government context. So sit back and hear from Keenan, and then we'll open up for some questions at the end. Cheers. Over to you, Keenan.
Thanks, Bradley. And thank you for the invitation to come and speak to FinPro. To be honest, I didn't know much about FinPro until the invitation came through, but we're really honoured to actually be invited to speak today. So ID, for people who don't know, we are one of the largest providers of demographic and economic profiles for local governments right across Australia. We work with a number of councils around Victoria, and we also provide forecasting, population forecasting services, economic forecasting services, and a number of things. Today, my presentation is really going to look at the year that was, okay? So it's historically going to look back at what happened last year from an economic and population perspective, and kind of give it a bit of a snapshot of where we're at the moment. So some of the information I'll say today, you've probably already heard, but I've tried to encapsulate it all in one kind of presentation, and hopefully there's something in there that will be informative. So I'll just share my screen. And we'll get going. And hopefully everyone can see that.
Perfect, Keenan, thanks.
Okay, COVID crisis, 1 year on. Today we're pretty much going to cover the year that was, and then dig down, so from a macro national level, then look at how did Victoria compare. And I'm sure we all know that it was a bit harder for people down here, and then who was most impacted, so kind of break that up into some different cohorts. What is the road to recovery? What are headwinds kind of preventing us from recovering quicker, and what are some trends coming out of that the last year that maybe accelerated because of that downturn? So the record is over. So we normally start with this side. So Australia used to spruik itself as one of the most best countries in the world for the longest period of economic growth. And so without a recession, I think it was us in the Netherlands. And the technical recessions is that 2 periods of downturn, so 2 quarterly periods of downturn. And we had that last year. So the March quarter we were slightly down, and then of course the June quarter we fell down by about 7%. The economy fell. So we haven't had those 2 periods since the early 90s when it was the recession we had to have. And so you can see in context there how much of a drop that was, that 7%. And since the ABS has been taking these kind of GDP accounts, it's the largest fall in quarterly GDP since the records began. So as we all know, it was unprecedented, that drop in GDP, but as expected, if you shut down, you know, pretty much a large part of the economy for right across the country for a period of time, you are going to get a massive fall. We haven't seen anything like that before. So what did people do during that time? Well, obviously, the uncertainty created a massive amount of savings. People just saved their money instead of spending it. And if shops weren't open, there wasn't much to spend on anyway. And so the savings ratio hit 20%. And as we said there, you didn't get that sort of savings ratio for probably, I don't know, almost 45 years back in terms of the early 70s. Historically, savings had been falling over a period of time. We're a great spending country during that period of time, but basically we just saved everything. And you know, the government early on put out all those stimulus packages, especially for pensions holders, $750, but there wasn't much to spend it on. And I know both my parents who are pensioners, they got that money and they just put it straight in the bank and just been sitting on it. And that's generally what happened to a lot of that money. So savings went up extraordinary. Business spending also dropped back to 2006 levels. So once again, no uncertainty involved there. So there wasn't much for businesses to spend on except for trying to maintain their staff levels. Unemployment, however, as we're probably aware, only rose to 7.5%. Now, 7.5% is still quite large, but in historical terms, if you look back to the previous downfalls, the GFC, the dot-com, and then the recession in the early 90s, considering how much our economy fell during that quarter, for unemployment to only rise by that amount is also quite extraordinary. And for anyone who lived through the early 90s, for most of the first half of the 90s, I mean, unemployment was above 10%, and it was extremely high in Victoria as well. So to have it only rise to 7.5%, although we all know that unemployment is one of those things that people debate about statistically, you only have to work for 1 hour a week to be regarded as having a job. So there's some discrepancies there. But the main reason for that is because of the unprecedented support from the federal government in terms of particularly that JobKeeper funding. So $52 billion was funneled out to businesses, and then $31 billion of that was on-flowed onto employees via the JobKeeper. And you had $16 billion worth of boosting cash flow. So extraordinary levels of money to match an extraordinary downturn in the economy, something we hadn't quite seen before. And obviously that, as we saw in the early 90s, there wasn't that level of support, funneling of money going out to businesses and everything. But this was a situation where government made a policy to restrict movements of people and restrict business activity. So therefore, as a kind of developed economy, we feel we need to come in and support businesses through that period. And strangely enough, household incomes actually rose during that period of time. So, if you look historically, the recession 1990s, household incomes fell. We've had periods in the late 90s where they fell. The GFC, we had periods household incomes fell quite substantially as well, but household incomes actually rose last year. And, the reason for that largely is social support benefits grew by 46%. So we had those coronavirus stimulus payments added to the job seeker. So New Start went to job seeker and it actually increased. So a large number of families around Australia actually who were on unemployment benefits got an increase in their incomes. And some people who are on job seeker payments who normally only worked a certain amount of hours a week actually saw their incomes rise. So social benefits, $15.2 billion rise in social assistance benefits, saw the average household incomes actually increase. But then there was nothing to spend it on, so they saved all that money. But it is quite a substantial difference to past kind of recessions, having that household income rise. So how did Victoria compare? Well, during that June quarter, the eastern states, the big powerhouse eastern states of New South Wales and Victoria got smashed. Falls of 8.5% for both New South Wales and Victoria. And largely, during that period of time, they were the states that got affected by COVID cases as well. New South Wales in the start with kind of the Ruby Princess outbreak and the flow on there, and then Melbourne later on. And generally, Melbourne and Sydney are the major international ports as well. So there was a higher potential for COVID cases to spread there. And and generally our CBDs in those two cities are the major economic nodes as well. And the CBDs are the ones that were largely affected by social distancing policies as companies put their professional services workers to work from home, and then hospitality was impacted dramatically in those CBDs. Retail turnover was hit hard, and Victoria's second lockdown, second wave, saw we had, as opposed to other states, as you'd be well aware, 4 months later, we had a 12.6%, another 12.6% fall in retail, which the other states didn't actually have in there. So, substantial hits to our economy. So, Victoria's numbers there, their job numbers, as the rest of the country kind of slowly grew back in May and June and kept recovering. But around July, Victoria kind of hit a wall and we plateaued during that period of time. As we went into the second lockdown, we saw a decrease, and our real recovery only started kind of middle of October there, when we started to increase, but we're still lagging the rest of the country by the end of the year in terms of job numbers there. And what happened to people? Well, if they could get out of the state, considering there was state barriers to movements, but if they could get out, they did. And where did they all go? To Queensland. Now, Queensland historically, in terms of population, attracts new residents. It's a net positive intake of interstate migration, and it generally always has. New South Wales generally always sheds people out of their states as well, typically across the border to Queensland. Victoria, during most of the 90s, we shed people as well. But recently, actually, Victoria recently, as you can see, September 2019 there, we had a net positive intake of people from other states. But in June, we lost people, and in September, it continued, and imagine in December, it probably continued as well. So almost 7,000 people left Victoria, and but also a similar amount of people were leaving New South Wales, and they're all going pretty much to Queensland. A slight movement to WA in September there. So who was affected most through a lot of these impacts as we went along? There's no surprises that tourism industry, nighttime economy was hit hardest. 1 in 5 jobs during that June quarter were considered to be lost. This is looking at payroll data, which is ABS for the first time has partnered up with the Australian Tax Office to release payroll data. So it doesn't cover all businesses, doesn't cover sole enterprises, but it covers quite enough amount of businesses across Australia to get some real trend analysis happening there as well. And so we're looking at, so accommodation, food, arts and recreation, almost 1 in 5 jobs lost there during that June quarter. But most industries were impacted, except we see down the bottom there, financial insurance services actually increased jobs in utilities during that period of time. As the year went on, some of those other industries recovered, but hospitality was still nowhere near where it used to be. The young and elderly were impacted, as you expected. If you're impacting hospitality jobs, you're impacting young workers, basically young casual staff were let go there. Typically what you find in recessions, older workers as well, some of them are forced into retirement, and so you get those older 65s or 70 plus were impacted there. Now, a lot of the commentary at the start was that females were impacted, and they were at the start because they had some more representation of those casual kind of jobs. But as the period of time goes on, it was actually quite evenly split between males and females there as time went on. Generally because healthcare wasn't impacted as much, and healthcare tended to be in some education as well, weren't impacted as much, and a lot of those who were compensated were JobKeeper, and those areas, except for tertiary education, but primary education, and a lot of those industries are female dominated, so the actual falls ended up being quite even as the year progressed. Looking at statewide here, we can see in mid-April, pretty much everywhere in the state was impacted because it was, statewide kind of lockdown there. As we got to mid-July, a lot of the most of the regions were still down on what they were in terms of jobs from March, but we'd seen recovery, and largely across regional areas, but also outer suburbs of Melbourne. But it's a little bit small there, but you can see inner Melbourne is still orange. So inner Melbourne in July, so we're talking the inner city around the CBD, was still 8% below their jobs as what they were in March. Then we went into the second lockdown, and you can see there it kind of, a lot of regions actually reversed. They went back to being 6% below what they were in March, and the CBD once again was still 8% or more below the jobs they had in March as well. But some of the regions, if you're looking at Warrnambool out to the west had kind of maintained a bit of their recovery in terms of jobs. This is a data set from Google. It's Google Mobility. So Google tracks wherever you go. If you've got an Android phone and you use Google Maps, it's way better than the kind of COVID mapping app that was set up to track where you are. And anyway, you can use this to identify. They break down trips by trips to workplace, trips to residence bases, trips for retail, recreation, this data. And we can see there the real difference between kind of Melbourne's CBD and some of the other areas across the strait. So I just highlighted there, you know, Ballarat by the end of the year was almost back to normal in terms of their trips to workplaces across the LGA there, where the city of Melbourne was, you know, half the workplace trips were still not happening there. So people working from homes or unemployed generally there. So the CBD still hadn't recovered its workplace trips. Looking at job seeker data there, you know, we've got massive percentage growth there in a number. This is what's called done by SA2 regions. So they're the ABS geography that kind of approximate suburbs, not quite, but they do their best, the SA2s. We can see there those inner South Bank, Docklands, East Melbourne, inner suburbs rising by 400%. Now, these are suburbs that don't normally have high amounts of people on job seeker because the proximity to employment is huge. I mean, the CBD there's proximity to jobs everywhere. But when that CBD shut down, obviously you're getting a massive increase in job seekers there. In terms of numbers, but you're looking at the suburbs with the most amount of people. So the outer suburbs, Tarnee and Dandenong, but Melbourne also, inner city Melbourne there, you had a large increase, you know, 1,400 people moving on to getting job seeker assistance during that period of time. There has been some slight recovery, but not as quick as we're showing in the other states. The road to recovery. So what's happened since that downturn? Well, Victoria went shopping again. So in November, particularly, we had the largest monthly change in retail turnover on record. So the doors open. We saw the images of people lining up for Kmart at midnight. Crazy. It's not something I want to do, but a lot of people obviously wanted to do it. And yeah, we just went massively shopping there, and our retail turnover went skyrocketing back to the rest of Australian average by November. There was a little bit of dip in December. I think everyone probably did most of their Christmas shopping must have done in November. So December kind of fell away, but November was such a peak that it was natural that the turnover was going to drop a bit in December. There was a surge in houses approved, and this is quite remarkable here. So there's obviously a number of incentives to Australia's economy. A large part of Australia's economy has been built on construction over the last decade, feeding the demand from international migration. But we've continued those incentives. It's obviously the federal government policy to support new housing and renovations and stuff there, and considerable Victorian government support for new houses. You see December, from seasonally adjusted, so ABS adjusts their housing numbers based on the different seasons. It was highest on record, the highest month on record, seasonally adjusted. If you look at just actual numbers of houses, so not with that adjustment, September and October for new houses being approved in Victoria had the second and third highest on record. If you look at that quarter, it's going to easily be the highest quarter for new houses being approved. Not necessarily apartments, but new houses being approved on record in Victoria. Growth in employment. So we've seen the number of employers from the labour force survey surge back upwards from October onwards, back up to kind of levels that we had early in the year. And as employment opportunities have increased, people have come back into the workforce. So in March, before pre-COVID, there was about 66.4% participation rate. So participation is how many people working age population are in the labour force, either with a job or looking for a job. So that was normal for Victoria. It dropped down to about 63% around September in that second lockdown. So that means people just stopped looking for work. If there's no jobs, then some people just stopped looking for work, or had to stay at home to look after kids and take care of elderly, etc. As employment opportunities increased, they came back into the labour force, and by January, you can see participation rate is back where it was in March. But all those people come back into the labour force, there may not necessarily be enough jobs for them, and that's why the unemployment rate hasn't fallen back to what it was in March, but it has fallen back from what it was in June. So positive signs there. So yeah, have an estimate of over 200,000 more employed than in September right now. Job advertisements. This is online job advertisements from the federal government. They track this, have been surging. And it's the regional areas. So I think this touches on what Bradley and other people spoke about at the start of this presentation. Is we're seeing Bendigo up 51% compared to January last year, and this is a 3-month rolling average they take here. Ballarat up 50%, Gippsland up 50%. Greater Melbourne, so these are quite large areas it's done by. Greater Melbourne actually isn't up on January last year, but it's only slightly down, so that's positive. But the regions are actually surging in the job advertisements. You would expect an increase in job advertisements after the year we had, in the lockdown we had, because people have to rehire some staff that they've let go and stuff as well. But the regions are really surging there. Domestic travel has returned slowly, so you can see a slight uptick there in interstate passengers in December, but it's nowhere what it was, having over 2 million passengers go in and out, domestic passengers in and out in the year previous, but we had about 340,000, so it's slightly ticking up. And we took a break. We took a break to holiday stops. This is Google data as well for, I think, Surf Coast Shire. And you can see there in January, the numbers, this is compared to the January previous for a number of those days there. It's a rolling average once again. They exceeded the numbers that they had in the January previous. So we all went out and, well, most of us who were lucky enough, we got away and had a break. Okay, so that's the recovery, but there are some headwinds for Victoria going forward. The big one, population tap turned off. Victoria's economy has largely been growing over the last decade because of, in actually Australian economy, because of international migration. Victoria in particular, actually our GDP per capita has been falling for a number of years. So while we spread big GDP numbers, economic growth is wonderful, our actual economic growth per capita level, so which is generally what our welfare is measured by, was actually falling. And we tend to hide this. Most national and state governments hide that figure. But it's picked up overseas by OECD and stuff, who have been concerned about this for a while, that we're actually not growing our living standards in Australia for a while because the GDP per capita hasn't been increasing. And that tap is turned off now, so what will happen in the economy? International tourism and education is a huge part of Victoria's economy, and that it will continue to be impacted all through this year. Will households return to spending on other things apart from retail, or will they continue to save? Will businesses be able to invest? That's a question. And there's still ongoing trade tensions as well, as we know, with China in particular. So, as I said there, Victoria relies heavily on international migration. In the 2019 period, we received the most amount of international migrants out of all the states in Australia. So it's a huge component. And if we turn that off, what has happened? The flow-on effects to construction. We saw the massive amount of houses being built, but actually apartments, there's still approvals of apartments. There's going to be a hell of a lot of empty apartments, but if we don't get some of the international migration kicking up again, and that's has some risks. The Great Exodus. During the 1990s recession, when Victoria's unemployment was above the national average by about 1.5%, we saw a massive exodus. So in a 2-year period there, over 53,000 people left the state. And Queensland, once again, most of them went to Queensland. Whether or not they came back later on, I'm not sure. But there is a real possibility that the same thing could happen. You could lose a lot of people, interstate migration to other states, Queensland, if our unemployment maintains higher than the other states. But you know, the state government is wanting to prevent that, and they're spruiking that we're going to have the best bounce back ever. And signs are positive so far in that regards, but I imagine some people will still leave. Strong growth in terms of this population growth for Victoria. So these are our forecasts done by ID. So we have dedicated population forecasts here. We've estimated by 2025 a fall from our pre-COVID estimates of 310,000 people, which was obviously huge. And that's largely to do with international migration. So that's going to play out over the years coming ahead. So, and even in regional areas as well. If you go to the next slide, these are our difference, our forecast difference from the base case forecasts that we had pre-COVID. And we've got there even regional areas as smaller than their base case, but less than the metro area. And so while in the short term, some major regional areas are getting a bit of an uplift in population growth in the short term, if you turn off that tap of international migration, where you've got less people coming into Melbourne and then the growth areas of Melbourne. So affordability may increase in those growth areas. So there may be less people then flow on being pushed out to regional areas as well. As we've all forecast, there's a lot of uncertainty around this, but that was the main thing driving a lot of our population increases with that international migration. You turn that off for a couple of years, then the change from the base case is a fall there. International education, as I said, is a major export. It's actually, compared to other states, it's a larger contributor to Victoria, 2.8%, more than New South Wales, more than Queensland. ACT, I think, is about on par with us in terms of its contribution to us, but it's a huge contribution to our gross state product there, and a major export for this country, so for this state. So in particular, we need to sort out some system there, particularly for universities, but also the flow-on effects to housing expenditure, especially in the CBD there. And no travel bubbles in sight at the moment. You see there, like, international passenger numbers this is inbound. So we were having about 500,000 people coming in to Melbourne Airport on a regular, I think that's monthly basis here, and that's just gone to nothing. Okay, so that has a huge impact on our tourism and hospitality. We've seen across Australia some domestic tourism bounces. People can't go overseas, so they're spending it locally. They're going out to areas within 2 hours of a metro areas and stuff, and that's been great, and it's done well. You've seen that in Queensland and places as well, huge boost for domestic tourism. But in the long term, we need that international tourism return, and especially the CBDs, like Melbourne relies on that, as opposed to the regional areas. A lot of our international tourism comes into Melbourne. Households are saving. We saw that at record levels. It's dropped a little bit, but it's still at historical highs. If that continues, then you have flow-on effects to consumption as the year goes on. Our new capital expenditure has dropped massively as well compared to what it was. And for Victoria, in December, we were down 15% in capex expenditure in Victoria. So that, because of that uncertainty, and if that continues, that has flow-on effects as well. So you get a bounce in the economy pre-lockdown, but there's a chance that you could drop off later on this year. Trade tensions as well. We saw individual industries be impacted there by trade, particularly the lobster and a few other industries there, and China, the merchandise exports fell away. Obviously, our international education fell away, but also some of our commodity exports have dropped there, and whether that continues or not, but specific industries were impacted. So NIA, our National Economics, through our economic data provider, they're predicting that uptick, which we saw, this is for Australia, in that December quarter. But you know, it's not all smooth sailing, and it's not a direct V and we're back to pre-COVID levels. We're going to get a bit of a bumpy road ahead. So as that investment and consumption expenditure continues to be low and tourism impacted, there's a real chance, and when JobKeeper ends as well, there's a real chance that we could get a minor dip or a plateauing of economic growth before another recovery and then another dip as well. So there's a lot of uncertainty. So now let's look at some of the trends. So history shows when you get a downturn, economic downturn, you tend to get, there's some trends that have been bubbling away in the economy pre a downturn, and then generally you get a magnification of those trends coming out of the downturn, so an acceleration. So we've had a bit of remote work for the last 15 years. It didn't quite live up to the kind of dreams and talks about that commentary was about 15 years ago when everyone said, oh, everyone will be working from home from the internet. But now we've got the NBN. Now people have experienced working from home, and businesses have adapted their policies to it as well. I'll touch on some of these trends now. This is a McKinsey report. I'm looking at the USA economy, but you could transfer some of it to in America. They've gone through and looked at industry by industry. What is the potential to work from home? And they're saying there that, you know, like 3/4 of some industries, especially finance and professional services, business services, 3/4 can potentially be done remotely, anywhere in the world, from your home or from interstate as well. And we've shown that pretty much during the COVID lockdown that you can work. It is challenging. I know I've got 2 kids, you know, 4 years and under at home. It's challenging to work from home with kids and everything, and if you've got school-age kids as well. But it can be done. Some of the other industries, though, are very hard to be done remotely there. Increased digitization, automation there. This will only this trend will continue, and you know, with 5G technology as well, increasing the ability to and the efficiency of digital transactions and digital monitoring and automation of machinery in a multiple amount of industries. Businesses will have to take advantage of this. So some of these businesses, their revenues have taken a massive hit. They need to be more agile and lean, so they need to have more automated processes, can make decisions a lot quicker. The increase for retraining, the need for retraining during a downturn and a recovery phase is always exacerbated and stuff. And so, you know, the government's provided a lot of support for, they decrease the cost of some university degrees or postgrad degrees and stuff, and there will need to be a massive amount of retraining. But also, we know what's shown over the last year that some people get left behind in what's called the gig economy and stuff. And so it raises these questions around the support for people with job insecurity and the need to raise some of those job seeker or new start payments and stuff, and also provide increased supports in terms of job security regulations. Australians are shopping online. So this is from Australia Post. Year-on-year growth, January to January, 44% increase in online purchases. The value of online purchases across a number of different sectors there as well. Fashion was a big one there. 5.2 million households are shopping online. So it's the new reality as well. Despite people, you know, lining up to go into Kmart, the physical store, the amount of online shopping that was done last year, it was incredible, and it's created huge need for warehouses and distribution channels to deliver all those, and that's going to continue. Another trend there to touch on here is the supply chain vulnerabilities. That should be vulnerabilities, not vulnerabilities, but it showed there there was a lot of impacts and supply chain constraints in a number of countries there. So there was a need then to kind of get local supply chains up and running, and a lot of manufacturers actually adapted their ability to generate new products this year, which was quite remarkable. And the federal government's getting behind this with a $1.3 billion initiative. Almost finished here. Some considerations for local governments through that last year. These are some trends I picked out from an Infrastructure Australia report. people working from home, household waste increased by 20% during 2020. So it's a huge demand for waste services and how to get rid of those services. And we're already having some problems with recycled, the ability for where recycling was going to go because of some of those contracts being torn up in China. A lot of infrastructure has been having to be renewed. We've got 100-year-old pipes in a number of areas, and a lot of infrastructure has been heavily utilised in residential areas as people were working from home, but commercial areas have been underutilised. There's excess building capacity in some leased commercial premises. Massive transport challenges there. Public transport in Victoria is nowhere near the levels, the usage of it, patronage of it, as what it was over a year ago. And as people have gone back into the cars and other options. So that creates an interesting question for infrastructure and council-owned airports as well. Maybe not as much as Victoria, but other states, there's a lot of council-owned airports as well who've received a massive hit to the revenue base. Increasing, and the big thing there is this financial uncertainty for local governments, increasingly demand for delivery of online services and local delivered services as well, at a time where your revenue base is being massively hit. And local councils in Victoria already had constraints going into this period by rate caps from the Victorian government and other like revenue flow-ons from state governments being constrained as well. But now that's exacerbated the problem because there's a huge demand for local governments more than ever before for those locally delivered services, and that will continue. And so my final words here, because I'm running out of time here, is the greatest economic event in recent memory saw the greatest economic support and response from a federal level, massive amounts of dollars that we've never seen before, state support as well, local support. And every local government we talked with was giving out business support, resident support, trying to employ local people in the jobs, a brilliant contribution from that. But now is the time, as we come into a recovery period, to reconsider how things were being done. We need to start investing in a more inclusive, and we saw GDP per capita hasn't been increasing for years and years, and a lot of people in insecure jobs are actually being left in the wayside. And so we need to think as a society and a local government as well, how we make a more inclusive growth, economic growth going forward. And now's the opportunity. So I'll leave it there. I've got to touch on here, if you want to get in touch with ID, check out some of our products. We work with hundreds of local communities, as I said. One of our big products we did last year was COVID impact for local government. So check out your website for your local government. We have an economic COVID impact. We also have an economic forecast we've done for a number of councils, a 2-year forecast of jobs and value added to try and get a sense of what might happen going forward. We've also got other things, health checks and demographic profiles. We do population forecasting as well. A number of local councils are probably looking for an update to their forecast going forward. So I'll leave it with that and I'll take any questions.
Thanks, Keenan, and that was absolutely fantastic, mate. And I think there's a couple of items in the chat, but basically that gives finance managers, CFOs, and everyone else a great opportunity to get some pre-information as we really go into the budget sitting. So yeah, if you're happy to take a couple of questions, if people want to put them into the chat, I've had a couple texted through to me, so I might just start with them, Keenan. One of the things that we're not so much struggling with as a sector, but we need to work on is development of a 10-year financial plan. And one of the key ratios that we're needing to include in there is a CPI. And I'm just interested in terms of how quickly you think the CPI might return to normal, or what a rate that we could sort of put a little bit of science behind to utilise as our CPI increase for those sort of, particularly that 5 to 10 year period.
Yeah. Good question. I mean, it's an interesting thing with the CPI. We did see an uptick in the CPI in the end of last year's quarter, but I mean, RBA will do their forecast for this going forward in the ABS as well. I can't see it ticking up too strongly as in the near couple of years and everything, just because of a lot of those headwinds and constraints to a number of areas. The interesting thing about the RBA as well, the RBA had, its main monitoring thing and main thing for target, the main thing for changing interest rates was around the CPI. And that's what it is, to keep that 2 to 3% band. And they've done very well in doing that. But what we saw actually in the last year is that actually there was a lot more pressure on them to, there's low flexibility. They can't move anywhere now. They've decreased interest rates so low that the only opportunity is to go into negative interest rates, which other countries have done. But there's just so little room for moving then. So how do you then try to target that CPI and get it around that band if you can't really change monetary policy too much? So it'll be a question on the national level then about what is the role of federal government in targeting that CPI and stuff. And so I think you'll find as time goes on that, a slight return, which we've seen to Keynesian economics, where the federal government will look to play more of a role there in kind of playing around with economic growth and economic targets and the CPI as a whole. So in terms of, and the CPI has been an interesting a measure because quite often it leaves out housing costs as well sometimes, and as we know, that's a huge expenditure item. For most, obviously, the main expenditure item for a number of households and stuff. And so housing costs, you'll see increase, we're seeing rents go up in a number of places, so for new houses and everything. And we're seeing prices go off across Melbourne. However, apartment rentals, you can buy cheaper strips in a city as well going forward. But if international migration doesn't return, once in a couple of years, all the supply of new housing comes on board and the demand hasn't returned, then you'll probably kind of see a kind of restraint in housing as well. So that, and then that'll play through to the CPI and other things. So if people's housing prices are going up, they feel more comfortable spending money as well. So generally, but if they feel that the housing price is going to go down, then you see that return to a savings ratio go up. They spend less, and then that flows through to reduced prices as well. So that was a bit of rambling exercise there. But a 10-year forecast, it's very hard to forecast out 10 years. But I think in the short term, you're going to see a rise to CPI. But I think then it'll come back a bit.
No, thank you for that. And you actually touched on one around the housing that I was going to ask. So that's fantastic. One of the things I'd be interested in part of your work and your organisation, if you're seeing that sort of targeted local projects or initiatives from an economic perspective, are you seeing any that is working really well for our officers to sort of go back and say, oh, XYZ's been doing A, B, C in their area, and that sort of worked well to see some sort of economic stimulus and recovery?
Yeah. So yeah, there's a lot of councils do, like in Victoria as well. I think my council, Maribyrnong and stuff in Darwin did it, and across Australia, those kind of buy local campaigns and everything. So where they were discounting, had like little apps, people purchased a voucher and then the council would discount them, and that was quite good at increasing that local expenditure during the COVID time. Coming out of COVID recovery period, obviously there's a massive amount of funding available. So you got the round of Building Better Regions Fund. There's Victorian community funds as well, and I think it's kind of the standard in general is having your priority projects there, which we always say, having that list of projects that you've already evaluated in past, that are ready to go with a clear evidence base, a clear benefit cost assessment, that are ready to basically package up for the federal or state government funding and stuff. And those councils will have that ready to go, are generally the ones, bearing aside the fact that if you're in a coalition electorate, you might be more likely to be funded. But generally, if you've got those priority projects ready to go with a good evidence base, you can get them into as many funds as possible. You're going to get them funded, and it's getting that momentum going and stuff, and that creates confidence as well. I think the councils as well, who've been very good at looking at what are their industry assets and leveraging off that as well. So if you know your big, if you've attracted, like, you know, Geelong's has worked very well, obviously, with the state governments in attracting kind of state government administration officers out over a number of years, and they've built on that. And then the next point then is to market yourself as, you know, they're a really good case there for superannuation services, insurance services, administration, and then using that to attract other kind of auxiliary services officers as well. They're very good as well. So, you know, it's what else have we seen across local governments? The local governments, towards the end of the year, a number of local governments in other states did their kind of regional tourism campaigns very successful. Scenic Rim outside of Brisbane did a campaign that was extremely successful, where local businesses actually told them to stop advertising because they were just getting run off their feet. Now, that coincided with the fact that you know, people couldn't go overseas and they're looking for places, but there's some locations in Australia who weren't on the radar of Australian residents to visit historically, and their branding had been quite low. Now is the time to get your branding really good, because people will be competing for that domestic tourism dollar more than ever. So if your local government who's really got, or partnered with a number of other regions as well to get that kind of region. I know Coffs Harbour in New South Wales partners with their neighbouring regions to market the package of the beach side of Coffs Harbour, but also the hinterland as well. And they create a really strong branding image as well. So domestic tourism going forward in this year and next year will be very competitive for those regions. So you really need to get your branding on track. Yeah, sorry, another rambling answer.
No, fantastic. One of the things we've seen is massive stimulus from both federal and state government. And a lot of that's been funded by significant borrowings. There's probably a fair bit of pressure on from the Victorian state government on local government to continue to borrow more. But just interested in terms of how well you can see state and federal government continuing that stimulus money, and how much longer they can continue that for.
Yeah, you're right. It is an interesting question. It's very different for the federal, yeah. So, I mean, federal government can theoretically borrow as much as they want because the Reserve Bank can keep lending them money, theoretically, and you have this the theory that the federal government could just, through the RBA, could just write off that debt. So there's theories about that. State government is a different beast. However, I mean, interest rates in capital, access to capital is extremely, you know, interest rates at the lowest amount, access to capital is really easy to get. So those stimulus could continue for a large period of time, actually. In the medium to long term, but if you're going to keep doing, if you're going to need those big stimulus packages, then the whole revenue structure for local governments and state governments needs to be looked at. And some of these kind of, even these initiatives that were looked at, you know, we had tax reviews at the Henry Tax Review at a federal level, you know, almost over a decade ago. But I think the funding model for local governments is the long-term funding model needs to be looked at from those things, because I think it can't continue in its current capacity. In the state government as well, the funding can continue for a number of years. But if you turn off that international immigration tap as well, then you're turning off a revenue base in terms of a rate base as well going forward. But the services, the demand for services is only going to continue to increase, and that's what we talked on there. So I think in the short term, they're fine. In the medium term, they're going to have to look at the revenue base on a state government level. It needs to be looking at a tax base. They've relied on stamp duty for a long time, but now we're getting massive stamp duty discounts as well. So yeah, that's going to cause challenges from there. So and I think from a state base as well, they get, you know, GST contributions, and there's, for a number of years, even when I worked in in the State Treasury a long time ago, 8 years ago now, they talked about then trying to review the Commonwealth contributions with that GST as well, because Victoria didn't give it as much as other states, and I think it still needs to be reviewed. For the big population states actually when they were growing, the infrastructure needs were growing so quickly, they needed more of that kind of GST contribution from the federal government. So.
No, absolute food for thought there. Keenan, can I say a massive thank you to you? A fantastic presentation, and the slides were wonderful in terms of a great picture for us to sort of take on board. So thank you very much to Keenan. Appreciate you coming along and speaking to us today.